This presentation is going to step us through the Wyoming SQT updates. I will say before I start, they are listed in the version tables in the user manual and the science document, just so that you have that record of what has changed between the workbooks. Later today, there will be, actually at the end of this presentation, I'm going to open up the workbook so that we can enter some data and see some of the changes. But I just wanted to make sure I highlighted everything and that you have it in PowerPoint form as well. So first we're looking at the coolest thing. The workbooks now hold multiple reaches. So if you're sitting there with a project that has 20 reaches and you have 20 different Wyoming SQT version 1 workbooks, congratulations. In the new version, you only need 2 workbooks instead of, 20. They are set up to hold 10. You can make more copies of the QT workbook, but the project summary page only has like 10 entries for it. 10 entry area for 10 reaches. That makes sense. But yay! And I'll show you that when we open the workbook later. Oh, hang on. Before I move on from this page, there are a lot of aesthetic updates that happened. So having a consistent color scheme and I was playing in the old Wyoming SQT earlier today, and one update I was excited is that we had locked the row and column formatting in the old ones, so you can actually format your rows and columns in the new one. So it's still locked to protect formulas, but you can now, make all of your text legible, which is also exciting if you're an Excel nerd, which I am. And you will, if you don't already know that, then you will by the end of this presentation. The next big update that we've talked about and Will mentioned earlier today is that instead of just a catchment assessment worksheet, the next worksheet after you enter your kind of summary project data is going to be a restoration potential worksheet. And it's going to step you through the steps outlined on this page, which the first step is the catchment assessment, but then you're also going to identify if there are any deal breakers or anything that would prevent you from meeting your project goals that are going on in the watershed, or anything going on in the watershed that would prevent your reach from achieving its project goals. Also looking at, larger activities going on in the watershed, how large is your project and what can you realistically address with reach scale practices in your project, any constraints, so man-made constraints that are going to restrict your potential for lift within the project. And finally, what are your existing conditions? Like, and particularly if you're working in a 404 world where your goal might be to generate credits, like your amount of credits might be very much tied to what is the existing condition, like what's your starting point. But also for your existing conditions, how does that compare to your project goals? Where do you need to go to achieve them? And finally, determine your restoration potential. So we have renamed it from just the catchment assessment to step through a guided step through to determine your restoration potential. And why would we do that? And mostly it's restoration potential communicates realistic potential for your site. So the restoration potential process is not required for impact projects where you're not really trying to maximize stream function, right, or achieve ecological endpoints. You're going to have an impact on that ecosystem. So, but when you are doing restoration projects, communicating goals and making sure your goals are realistic for the site that you have selected is important. And just to note that, not every site slated for restoration can achieve lift in physicochemical and biology, but the sites that can and can document that lift, like they're out there and they will get more credit using the SQT. So just being upfront in your restoration potential selection. So the two options are partial or full, and full means that you can restore physicochemical and biology functions to a reference condition. Partial is just admitting that there are other things going on that your reach scale project, cannot overcome to, not that you can't have lift for those categories, but that you cannot achieve a fully functioning condition like a reference standard. All right, now I get to geek out a little bit. So Will's mentioned a couple times, those H&H people, and I am one of those H&H people. So I am very excited about this update. So the Wyoming SQT version 1 has a flow alteration parameter in the reach scale assessment where you assess base flow. Um, and that parameter is no longer there. And instead, there's a flow alteration module. So the benefit of a module rather than having it as a parameter in the reach scale condition assessment is that you can define your reach breaks differently. So that whole presentation I gave earlier about all the things you'll look at to define and assess the condition within your reach, when you are doing hydrologic modeling, you might have a much longer reach. And when you're only looking at the flow values, you might have different reach breaks than what goes into the reach scale condition assessment. So by breaking it into a separate module, you can define what is the affected stream length for that hydrologic analysis that you're doing for the flow alteration module. So it captures both flow reductions and also augmentation. So if you have a transbasin diversion and you have one stream that's losing flow and another that's gaining flow, both of those can show change due to their changed flow regime, their changed hydrograph. Metrics are flow volumes or discharge, and they're always compared. So they are a ratio where you're going to compare your observed to your expected. So that means when you're doing this analysis, you're actually going to have three. I think my camera's on. You're going to have three values. So you're going to have your pre-condition observed, or sorry, pre-project observed. You're going to have your post-project observed, and those values, I mean, pre-project and post-project, that is the only thing that changes between your condition assessments. You're also going to need to determine what is the expected or natural. Hang on, I don't have my laser pointer yet. um, your natural flow, your native flow regime. So what is expected in the absence of, everyone taking water out of the streams. And that's the value that you're going to compare your conditions to. And that this value, the expected value, does not change between pre-project and post-project. This is a list of the metrics that is largely based on the watershed flow evaluation tool. So I have a reference here, and I have the full reference on a slide later, just in case you want to nerd out and read a bunch of fun stuff about hydrology. The flow alteration module is identical between the Colorado SQT and the Wyoming SQT. So for anyone out there that's working in those states, the flow alteration module is the same. The activities to create lift is managing water rights, managing irrigation. And I know for Wyoming, dam removal or dam installations, like where you put a dam, you change the hydrology to the reach downstream and you might impound the reach upstream. This is an important note. We are not talking about changes to channel geometry. If you are changing channel geometry to improve something like your base flow depth, that's going to be captured in either base flow dynamics or bank full flow dynamics. So that's a different parameter, and to me, a different functional category. It's a hydraulic instead of hydrologic. So we are looking at the activities that change the water that is coming into the reach. All right, I let myself geek out a little bit longer because I think I have the time in this presentation. But most SQTs don't look at flow alteration, and they focus on the land use change and also concentrated flow points, which is well noted, like speeds up the routing of the how water drains. So when I think of like time of concentration, it's speeding up the drainage of the landscape. Um, land cover, it matters for how much precipitation is intercepted. It matters a lot for how much runoff is coming off and also affects the infiltration and transpiration that is occurring within this hydrologic cycle. So like land cover is a good thing that we can measure and has direct impacts of like land clearing activities. Like we clear a lot of land, and whenever we're planting that riparian buffer, we're trying to reestablish the native community. But it does, focusing only on land cover, it leaves parts of the hydrologic process out. And when you're looking at hydrology that is coming into a reach, really I think about, I'm always making these lists kind of not in my head, but thinking about like how are our assessments capturing the different flows and the variability of the flows. So I'm always trying to remember the 6 hydrologic metrics because we're not just looking at magnitude. Usually there's like the 100-year discharge, right? That is the magnitude. That is the peak flow at a rare flood event. But there's also duration, timing, frequency, rise rate, fall rate, like all of those components of the hydrology matter to the ecosystems that rely on them. And also the environmental flow components, it has base flows. Base flow is a big deal. um, Particularly out west where you guys have a lot of water withdrawals, like, is there enough water during those base flow seasons? But also when you're looking at, like, something like a large dam project, are there when you remove the high flow pulses, like, that also has, impacts to the ecosystems that are downstream. And I added in red, so an annual flow volume is not one of the environmental flow components, but it is a metric in the, flow alteration module. So I added it to the bottom as like, the volume of water and how that changes is also important to the ecosystems. All right. I just put in here a couple tables from the user manual that kind of summarize the flow alteration module. So a description of each of their metrics. And what I really wanted to highlight is the data requirements. So if you don't if you only have monthly data for your stream gauges, then you cannot do the mean annual peak daily discharge. Like that's just not going to be a metric that you're going to have the data to be able to calculate, nor is the 7-day minimum. The other metrics require just monthly data. Um, yeah, and I'm not sure about the availability of monthly data or where I know you have a network of stream gauges, and we've provided links in the user manual to all the resources that I know are available for Wyoming. But there's a Colorado tool that has monthly data, and that's why there's a distinction of like what metric selection varies on your data availability. Um, This one's my more favorite table because it really captures, it kind of tells you why each of those metrics that's in the flow alteration module is being assessed. So when we're looking at mean August discharge or mean September discharge, we're really looking at summer base flow. So if you're somewhere, and there's a little note down here, if you're somewhere where like you're getting monsoons or like really big rain events like in August and September, and those months aren't representative of your summer base flow, then like you don't need to do September particularly. You could just do August if that's a better metric for your summer base flow. Also, if you're in an intermittent channel, there are some exceptions, and we have some guidance for how we've thought about the application of the flow alteration module in an intermittent channel. Okay, and with that, I will pull myself back out of the hydrologic modeling realm. This is the list of references for anyone who, loves reading about this stuff more. All right, and back to the main scheduled programming differences between the Wyoming SQT version 1 and version 2. I have a list of the parameters and metrics, and some of these things we've already mentioned. So flow alteration was in version 1 and is no longer in version 2. When Will gave his basic suite presentation on the parameters, he talked about bankful flow dynamics as a parameter that has been added. The Wyoming SQT version 2 also has a base flow dynamics parameter that's been added. To look specifically at base flow, so whether or not the water is flowing and meeting minimum depth requirements. Base flow dynamics, nope, too far in the weeds. I'm just gonna go into applicability. That's all right. I'll keep trucking down the list. We've added percent side channels as a metric to assess floodplain connectivity. We've replaced the size class pebble count analyzer method with a percent fines metric. Both required pebble count and a riffle specific pebble count. The size class pebble count analyzer required a reference reach to compare your project site to, and the bed material characterization, now we have data and we're able to develop reference curves so that we can just score the value that you measure at your project reach. We have removed aggradation ratio because that one moved up here to bankful flow dynamics. And we have removed sinuosity as a metric for scoring, although it is still requested and it is in the site information and reference stratification section that you still provide your existing and proposed sinuosity, because it is valuable information. It's just no longer used for scoring in the Wyoming SQT. All right, I just realized I'm out of water, but that's okay. I'll refill after this presentation. Um, into the nuts and bolts. Will gave you guys the tour to introduce reference curves. So the reason we packed the morning kind of full of the overview or like the introduction stuff is because I get to go directly in and say, oh, you guys have seen reference curves and are familiar with the x-axis is the measured value at your project site. And the y-axis is always going to be a scale of 0 to 1, where 1 is pristine, like no human modification, and 0 being no function. So I have a list of the reference curves that have been updated. I have an example pulled out. So some of the changes to reference scoring, like bank height ratio, were pretty easy and simple. So this curve only changed because we removed one point that defined the break between functioning and functioning at risk, and it just, made a straight curve. Scoring is going to update slightly between version 1 and version 2. Other updates were not less straightforward, less simple, but I mean, definitely still an improvement. So for land use coefficient, for example, that reference curve updated, and it only looks slight. I know you can't read these numbers, so it used to be 45 that defined the pristine condition, the score of a 1, and now it's 40 instead of 45. And for that lower end of the functioning range, it was 62 and it changed to 68. And this is important because, and it had to change because we updated our methods. So instead of, I think it was almost a full page of land cover or land use descriptions that were included in the Wyoming SQT version 1, that table has been condensed and simplified so that you are delineating fewer land uses. And so the 45 and the 62 that changed the reference curve that define the functioning range of scoring is tied to the updated method in the new land use table. I have a note down here. I can't go into this much detail on all of the edits, so just to make sure you guys know, assessment methods for land use coefficient, all the riparian vegetation metrics, and fish sampling were updated. I do talk more about vegetation. For fish sampling, our edits were primarily just providing clarification and additional detail. Vegetation, this figure looks familiar. Will had it in his presentation. When he talked about riparian extent. In terms of updates, the Wyoming SQT version 1 required you to measure the width at every one of your vegetation plot sampling locations. So the method has updated so that you are delineating using GIS polygons. You're going to delineate what is the expected extent. So it's an area-based method instead of a width method. Before it was still like, a percent of expected that you are scoring, and we are still scoring a percent of expected. It's mostly the method. So like you are going to be drawing polygons now. So the red in this figure is showing the expected riparian area. And the yellow line is showing that whatever's on the other side of this road has been cut off and is no longer part of the riparian extent. Here is a park in outside Denver, Colorado, where we have another example just showing the benefits or the benefit of an area-based method where this park has a lot of walking trails going through it. And clearly there's no riparian vegetation on those walking trails. But given that they are not an impediment, they're not like blocking overbank flow from providing it, there's still riparian vegetation on the other side of these trails, is the easier way to say that. They do not cut off the riparian area. So they are not included in the observed riparian area, but they also don't cut it off. Whereas the houses and then this larger trail that is raised does cut off the expected or the observed riparian area. This is, if I have not done a good job explaining it, these figures, this example is in the user manual. Um, Oh, and a note that our definition for the observed riparian area has also updated. So the observed riparian area is currently contains riparian vegetation and is free from anthropogenic disturbance, including urban development, intense ag uses, and resource extraction and changes in hydrology. Um, ooh, yeah. So in terms of determining, wait, I gotta go back. In terms of how you determine what your riparian extent should be, so that expected value that you are comparing your observed value to, we've provided more direction in how to determine that. So this green shading that is not explained in my PowerPoint slide is actually a US Forest Service mapping of riparian areas that corresponded well with historical aerial imagery. So we had aerial imagery and topo from before the houses came in because the houses kind of reshaped that land. And so we were trying to figure out what was the expected riparian extent before they started development in on this. And we found that that resource, the US Forest Service resource, matched the other data that was available. So that is your first step. There is another method, which I don't know how many of you guys have been using it, but the meander width ratio method to determine your expected riparian extent. That is a last case resort. So if you are going to use the meander width ratio method, you need to explain and show why there's no other data and that is applicable to help determine your expected riparian extent. Um, so when other resources have been explored and evaluated as not suitable, you can use the meander width ratio. I know it's easy because you can just go in and enter numbers and do it and it's done. And the other methods are harder, but the other methods are more accurate. They're better. And I circled the 7 here because this is updated from version 1. So it used to, in version 1, Wyoming SQT, it was a 4. And the reference that was cited, like it should have been a 7 for unconfined alluvial valleys. So that was a typo in version 1. All right. Further on into the updated methods. I know Will showed this earlier, so I won't rehash it other than to say like the nested plots are the same. The plot spacing is the same. The main update is that we have, instead of saying you need to start your plot at the edge of channel where the bed meets the bank, you need to locate your plots along bankful or the green line, whichever is closer to the stream. And this is after many field tests and going back and forth and like not really liking the edge of channel, but at some sites, but at other sites, like bankful's not a good estimate either. And so we have updated the guidance so that at different sites, you are still starting in a similar location. So somewhere on that edge of bank, like, bankful, if that's the most applicable, or if your green line is below bankful, then you will start there, but you don't need to start at the edge of channel, which may be underwater. That is the starting location for your vegetation plots. Ooh, manual updates. I don't know if I consider this my ugliest slide, but it's all right. And we will open the user manual later and I will click around in it a little bit, but I just wanted to show some streamlined formatting that we have imposed on all of our metric instructions. So we have functional categories and parameters. We did consistently provide definitions. It was more not scattershot, but I mean, we provided definitions where they were needed, but not necessarily every parameter had a definition to tell you this is what we're talking about when we are talking about this parameter. Throughout the manual, we have additional guidance on experience requirements. So as Will noted, you're not meant to do an SQT alone. And I mean, Will and I were talking about the green line stability rating, which we just don't have familiarity with that assessment method. And we don't have the ability to ID plant to the species level. So it's not something without a lot more training that we are going to be able to do. So for each parameter, there is a detail of like, hey, these are the skills you should have in order to be assessing these parameters in the SQT. And then for each metric, we have definition, method, guidance on how to estimate the proposed condition field value, including things that might change, like project activities that could alter the measured values at the site. And then we'll spend a lot of time on this later, but we also have documentation and field forms. So for each metric, what data should you be providing to the Corps of Engineers so that they can review and verify your data, your values that you have calculated? Oh, this one's my last slide. Then I get to bust open the SQT itself. So of course, with all of these updates that I have shown you, we have updated the user manual and the scientific support document to reflect those changes. Additional revisions, some of which, the ones in green, you already know about because we already gave you guys presentations on those. So we've beefed up bankful identification and verification. We have added, instead of just an existing and proposed stream type, you've got 4 stream types to enter in the Wyoming SQT. The Appendix A content, and I can do this little blurb now. So Appendix A in version 1, the goal was that you would have something you could print and take in the field, and it would have all the field methods you needed to perform the assessment. And so it included a lot of Wyoming DEQ documents, and it included them verbatim. So it was like a copy paste of like, this is how you survey. This is how you collect bugs and store bugs. This is how you do the rock scrape to do chlorophyll A. There was, however, still things we could not fit in the user manual. So for example, like there's a separate manual for how to effectively monitor temperature in a stream, and there behind near bank stress is a proprietary method, and it has its own user manual that goes with it. So the version 1 Appendix A tried to get as much in there as you could. The revised Appendix A is more streamlined, and I'm going to show you guys that one later after the next break. We'll take a look at what is in the streamlined Appendix A. But it does include a list of references of other things you might need to print. All right, there's also a lateral migration scoring exception and field forms. Field forms were updated, and there are required documentation forms. So we'll take a look at the list of what is required form for documentation, and then what is required for when you go out in the field, what kind of forms are required, because most of the field forms that were provided with version 1 were what we considered optional. Like if you're collecting data using a GPS, you're probably not going to use our field forms as you fill out and collect the data in the field. All right. All right. How am I doing on time? I have another 30 minutes. Yay. Were there any questions in the chat while I switch my screen?
We're good.
All right. This is the part because I'm taking you through multiple workbooks. I have a lot of workbooks open right now. But I wanted to take the rest of this presentation to walk through the SQT workbook itself. So last updated June 28th, 2023. This is the project summary worksheet. So the workbook is designed so you start with the tab all the way on the left and you work your way right. Project summary having, hang on. Let me make sure I have the right one open. Yeah, it has data in it. Okay. So the first question it asks you is, what are your programmatic goals? What funding drivers are funding this project. What's paying your bills and what goals do you have to hit, you have to meet. And it's space to expand and explain the programmatic goals of the project. You can provide a project name, project ID, the ecoregion, so whether you're in the basins, plains, or the mountains. And I'll go ahead and put us in the mountains because I want to show you guys something specific and weird looking when you're in a specific bioregion. So in the volcanic mountains and valleys, there's something special going on there. You need to select your river basin. River basin helps you determine the appropriate fish list to start with. So when you're doing fish monitoring, you have to determine what your expected species list is. And the user manual provides species lists that are based on your river basins. And then your 12-digit HUC.
Hey, Sydney.
Yeah.
We did get one request now that you're in the workbook to just kind of slow down a little bit.
Yes.
They love it. Love you. Love it. But just ask if you could slow down just a bit.
Oh, yeah. I'm channeling. I always say I'm like going to try to channel the Southern drawl and like slow it down. I always feel like my speed is very variable, like depending on if I'm thinking about it or not. Yes. Okay. Hang on. I will slow down because I have a checklist of things to show you to make sure I stay out of the weeds and make sure I show you what I want to show you. As noted, the first really exciting thing in the workbook is that it holds multiple reaches. And I noted that the project summary worksheet is set up to hold up to 10. You cannot add or insert rows to have more. So we do consider it like a SQT workbook will hold and account for up to 10 reaches, 10 condition assessments. But I will go ahead and show you. Oops. That you are able to make copies of the quantification tool worksheet. And here's something specific. So when I rename this tab, I have to label it with exactly the same string that is put into this cell in order for it to populate. So I had just made a copy of the quantification tool. Notice that the worksheet titled quantification tool, I told it that its name was reach 1, whereas the QT2, I told it that its reach name was hello world. So now you'll see, and I will zoom in so you can actually see that the reach ID has automatically populated as hello world. Whereas if I make another copy, wait, I shouldn't rename it yet. So the first time I make a copy, there we go. The reach ID is coming up blank because it doesn't know, like, this worksheet title isn't linked to an entry in my project summary tab. So if I rename it to QT3, it now knows that I named this one Frank. Which I know you're all like in your office just being like, wow, that's so cool. It's virtual, so I'll just do the sound effects myself and it'll help slow me down. There is, no, that's okay. I let myself geek out about the flow alteration module. We didn't include 10 lines for the flow alteration module. I don't know how many affected reaches to expect from projects utilizing the SQT or the FAM in the SQT. For now, we've included 3. So you can do something similar where you can make copies of the flow alteration module. I'll name this one Sydney. And show you one more time. So in case that went too quick for everybody, like I come over to the flow alteration module tab, right click, and I go to move or copy. and I click this button that says create a copy. And when I clicked up here, I'm just telling it where I want that copy to go. So you see the last option is to move it to the end. When I click reference curves, that means it's going to put it in between the flow alteration module and the reference curves. And so right now, this one does not have a reach ID, but as soon as I rename this to FAM2, you can see that the ID that I gave it on the project summary sheet comes up. Yay! As noted in the reach break presentation, there's space here that you must populate. You have to say how you determined, like, what makes reach 1 different from reach 2. How did you determine your reach break, so that is documented in the SQT workbook. And in terms of reviewing these, like, once you see the reach break criteria, you know a little bit more what to expect when you're reviewing your quantification tool data. So if this says, reach was broken because the streams are a different slope, then you should see that in the slope entry of the different reaches. It's really good when you're looking for typos to look at, like, what constituted the reach break. Same for the flow alteration module. So as you enter data for your up to 10 reaches and up to 3 flow alteration module affected reaches, this project total will update. So this project total, the overall workbook total for change in functional feet, does not have a qualifier on it. And I believe I'm getting ahead of myself. Hang on. I'll let my screen catch up. Is it switching okay when I, like, switch between tabs, or is there a delay when I change tabs?
I am not seeing a delay.
Yeah, it's been okay for me.
Yay. I'll show you the last thing on this one, and then I'll be bouncing around a little bit less. When I populate the stream order and flow type, these values will show what stream type and order that the change in functional feet is associated with. Because you might have different resources throughout the project area that are entered, this project total is not going to include that qualifier, but it is the only place where you will find that delta not associated with like a P3, which would be a perennial third order stream, or an E1. Like, this score is associated with an ephemeral first order stream. The last one down here, which I pre-populated, and I don't expect you to read it, but just know that I've entered the goals and objectives that are provided as an example in the user manual for my Reach 1. And this is important. Do not skip entering your goals and objectives here on the project summary worksheet, and you have space for all 10 of your reaches to outline and detail your goals and objectives. Because when you get over to your quantification tool worksheet, those design goals and objectives show up here so that you can compare them to your parameter summary. So if your objectives are specific and parameter, I was going to say parameter quantifiable, but that's not really a term. But if your objectives are specific, and you can see here, this first one says reducing bank height ratios from 2 to 1. So if my objective is that specific, I can come to scroll in this quantification tool worksheet to see if that objective was achieved. So I can look at my metric scores, my metric field values, or my parameter scores to check if the goals and objectives of the project have been achieved. And everybody goes, yay! Oh, that's fun. If you have any problems or errors, contact Paige or Rachel, and you can copy me, especially if it's a spreadsheet error. But Rachel and Paige are your go-tos for tool updates. All right. How am I doing on time? I might get through everything I want to. Wait, Will left me extra time, didn't he? Yeah. Okay. I'll give it a minute to update. Oh, it popped up with a note you guys probably can't read, but I was not going to step you through the restoration potential process. I put the steps up in the slide deck. but I wanted to show you a couple things that are specific to being in the workbook, which there is a note here that mentions what I'm about to show you. Because the new workbook contains multiple reaches and they might be on different streams, you might need multiple copies of the catchment assessment form. So for the example I was using in the reach break one, I had two streams. I had a main stem and then I had a tributary. So the main stem would not have the same catchment assessment answers as the tributary. So I would need two copies of this, and we have hidden extra copies. How many extra copies? 3? Okay, I gave you 2 extra copies for a total of 3 copies of the catchment assessment. And they are hidden. You'll see if you're looking at the row numbers, it jumps from 22 to 55 in the version. And that is, in case your project has multiple streams or you need multiple copies of the catchment assessment. You're going to fill out all of these gray boxes. And then here at the end, this is the important part. You're going to provide the entry for restoration potential, whether or not it is full or partial. And this drop down here at the end carries over to populate. Hang on. I had to make those really big to capture all my goals and objectives. The restoration potential, oh, it's here. So I told it that the quantification tool reach 1 had a full restoration potential, but I told it that the hello world reach had a partial restoration potential. And so that the entry on the restoration potential sheet carries over and populates on the quantification tool sheets. Okay, I already did design goals and objectives. Oh, the other entry. There's also populated a description of your restoration potential. So that also populates from your restoration potential worksheet. And then required for entry on this spreadsheet is describe the rationale for your design stream type selection. So for Savory Creek, the design stream type matches the reference stream type. Or if you're working in an urban channel, your data entry or your entry for this field might be the design stream type is a B(c), urban encroachments prevent a C stream type or an E stream type, typical for the valley of that stream. But you must document that in this spreadsheet. And, oh, I'm in QT too, that's why. But you'll see, as Will noted in his presentation, there are 4 data entry spots for stream type. So you've got your existing, your design, proposed, and reference stream type. Okay. And I told you I had selected volcanic mountains and valleys for a reason. Bear with me really quick. I'm going to delete it for a second so you can see this ugly black box that appears in your site information and reference stratification section. The note here, this text will change based on your input. So when we were looking at the percent riffle data from the reference data set. So we compiled data from the Forest Service, we compiled data that we collected, and also that I believe Fish and Game had, but there were multiple sources. But it turned out like streams in the volcanic mountains and valleys have a very high percent riffle, kind of regardless of their slope. So they clustered separately, and the ANOVA analysis said these are statistically significant, they are distinct. So when you are in the volcanic mountains and valleys, you'll see my text changed. Instead of saying, hey, you're not in this ecoregion, so this ugly black box, just don't put any data there. Now it's asking you to enter the stream slope above. So if I have a stream that is 2% slope in the volcanic in the volcanic mountains and valleys ecoregion, then I must use the percent riffle curve that is specific for that ecoregion. The data that we had available were all from streams that were greater than 1.3% slope. So if my stream is in the volcanic ecoregion and my slope is less than 1.3, I can choose which reference curve is most applicable to my site. So this is getting real far in the weeds. And I mean, I explained it. There's lots of pictures in the user manual for the different, showing you those 3 texts on the left-hand side. And hopefully when the reference curves are in this right-hand most spreadsheet for you to check out. So if you have a low gradient stream, but you're in the volcanic valley ecoregion, you're going to want to think about which reference curve best matches reference expectation for your site. I'll try not to go further down that rabbit hole. Nope, I got 2 more things to show you in site information and stratification. I noted before, the plan form parameter has been removed. It is not a part of scoring, but knowing your existing and proposed sinuosity is still an important evaluation criteria. And so it is included. It has moved to the site information and reference stratification section, and it falls in the bucket of site information. There are no reference curves that are stratified by your sinuosity. Ooh, all right, this last one is the most fun one. And I'll zoom out a little bit. So the last entry in the site information section says most recent monitoring year. And that is because we have made a lot of edits to the quantification tool sheet that highlight monitoring and the monitored condition. And to do this part well, I'm going to pull up the Savory Creek example. So this spreadsheet is pre-populated with data from the Savory Creek project that is in chapter 5 of the user manual. But you'll see instead of just summarizing the overall change that was calculated from the existing and the proposed condition, we've moved up the monitored condition as well. So you have the overall delta from where you proposed it to be, and you can track progress throughout your monitoring period of the monitored condition. And that's where this little drop down, I wonder if I can get them on the same screen and still have it all legible. Let's see. Okay, so this drop down for the most recent monitoring year. For right now, it only has 2 entries in it, and it's probably too small for y'all to read, but it says 2020 and 2021. So if I toggle to 2020, you'll notice that this monitored column, it doesn't have any data in it anymore. But if I switch it to 2021, I get monitored condition results. Here, I'll make sure to go real slow because I got to scroll past a lot of stuff to get down to the monitoring condition data entry. So there is a table where you can enter the monitoring data, and it's all side by side. So you can enter the land use coefficient or the bank height ratio through like side by side and watch the changes in field value throughout the monitoring period. Whereas before, each monitoring condition assessment was its own separate table, and they were all stacked up on the monitored condition worksheet instead. And I noted that that drop down only had 2 entries in it, but if I start putting more entries in here, and I scroll back up, I think I've tried this on a screen share and it never shows up bigger when it's in the list, but hopefully you can tell that there's more entries to choose from in this list. And when you make this selection, it will change what monitoring year is being used to populate this column in your functional change summary and in your other summary tables. So the functional category report card also includes monitoring data. Let me go ahead and switch it back to the one that has data in it so you can see it populated. And then at the very, where you enter your existing and proposed condition field values, you have the color-coded scoring still right next to those field values. And then you also have scoring for that monitored condition assessment that you're looking, that you've selected in that section. So we have the functional categories are summarized at the top of the spreadsheet. Underneath your existing and proposed condition is where you have my favorite table, the parameter summary table. So here it will pull the existing, proposed, as built, and up to 10 years of monitoring. You can see how the parameter scores have changed throughout monitoring. And this used to be located in the version 1 workbook. It was on a separate spreadsheet. And now it's all in one spreadsheet so that you can make copies of it and have multiple reaches in one book. We have the functional category summary that shows all the monitoring, whereas the one at the top only shows your selected monitoring event. And then a summary by functional foot as well. This beautiful table is where you enter your field values. I'm not sure if it's showing up on your screen, but there's kind of a stipple shading. And we found that in trying to enter multiple columns of data, it kind of helped to have like a visual cue to help keep your eyes in line. So if, you know, I accept feedback on this formatting. We were playing with that a lot, like how to make it best stand out. So I accept emails of suggestions. Underneath the field values are the index values. So this is the score for each metric, and you can track that throughout monitoring as well. All right. Did I miss anything? Oh, actually, it's good I came back to the blank worksheet. So most people might come in and start entering some field values. They're like, yeah, I got all my field values documented. I calculated them all, and just start entering data. And it won't be until you get to entrenchment ratio where you might be like, man, I was on a roll. I thought this was working and now it's broken. If you get a false instead of a score and you are expecting a score, the most likely culprit is that you have not filled out something that is needed in the site information and reference selection section of the workbook. So it's at the top in those first 3 columns. And I will show you for entrenchment ratio, if I'm like, man, I don't know what data it wants from me in order to score it, I can come over to the reference curve spreadsheet. Now the reference curve spreadsheet shows you all of the reference curves that this spreadsheet is using. Our intent is not to make like a black box where you don't know how the scoring is happening. So you can refer here. It is organized in the same order that the metrics appear in the condition assessment, and then the columns are by the different functional categories. So entrenchment ratio is in the reach hydrology and hydraulics functional category. And so I will scroll down. Entrenchment ratio comes after bank height ratio. And I see here for the first one, it's saying ER, entrenchment ratio, for C(b) stream types. And if I scroll down more, entrenchment ratio for C stream types. There's a pattern here. Entrenchment ratio for E stream types. So I need to go back to my quantification tool spreadsheet, and it is looking for the reference stream type in order for it to score the entrenchment ratio value that I have given it. At the end of the science document, there's a big list of metrics that you can also refer to. If you have multiple screens and multiple items open, it should be the last page in the science document where you can, it has a whole list of the metrics and everything. There's like all the different stratifications and also all the threshold values that are used to define reference curves. So there's multiple ways to figure out like what data do you want if you keep getting a false value from the spreadsheet. All right, I got one more thing on my hit list for this spreadsheet. And then I'll move on to the flow alteration module. Oh, I only got 2 minutes left. All right, I'll at least show you the flow alteration module spreadsheet. I noted in my presentation, there is an exception to the roll-up scoring. All of the exceptions are outlined in the user manual. There's a bulleted list, and I want to point out this one because there is an extent of arboring that if you more than 50% of your reach is armored, then your lateral migration parameter is going to score a 0. Because if you have armored more than half of your reach, the bank lengths within your reach, then you have stopped or are attempting to stop the natural lateral migration processes of that stream. So you'll see I have field values that actually score functioning for the other two metrics, but because my percent stream bank armoring value is higher than 50%, the parameter is scoring a 0. Whereas I have the same entry over here for the other two metrics that are both scoring functioning, but my extent of armoring is less. It's 30% of the stream reach, which according to that reference curve scores a 0 for that metric. But my parameter score is still an average of all of the metrics assessed for lateral migration. And I'll skip showing you the FAM worksheet. That's all right. I have more time later to show you worksheets.